Welcome to Fiery Nights, where the darkest stories unfold in the stillness of the night. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you safely curled up in your room or perhaps surrounded by the noise of others? Or maybe you find yourself in a quiet, haunting place alone with your thoughts and the whispers of something far more sinister. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in. Tonight's tale will take you into the heart of darkness, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and the silence is deafening. Story 1. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of forgotten memories, as the darkness closed in around the old house. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches clawing at the windows like desperate hands trying to break through the glass. Somewhere deep within the heart of this decaying structure, a presence lingered, unseen yet ever-present, watching, waiting. The building loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the moonless night. Once grand, now weathered and decayed, it stood as a monument to the passage of time. The mansion, long abandoned, had been forgotten by most but not by all. Whispers followed the crumbling stone walls, carried by the wind that howled through broken windows and cracked doors. The forest around it seemed unnaturally still, as though even nature feared to venture too close. The leaves on the trees no longer rustled with the wind. They hung motionless, their colors drained into dull, lifeless shades. The faintest echo of a faraway owl could be heard, but even that seemed out of place, like a forgotten memory trying to claw its way back into existence. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of shadow and silence. The floorboards creaked with every step, as if they remembered the weight of lives long since past. Dust hung thick in the air, a tangible fog that clung to the walls and furniture, embedding itself into every forgotten crevice. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon, which pierced through gaps in the shattered windows, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaking pipe, or the distant groan of the building as it settled into the earth. But there was something else, something far deeper than the silence of abandonment. It was a presence unseen but felt. It lingered just beyond the edge of perception. The air seemed to grow colder, thicker, as though the very house itself was holding its breath. At the heart of the mansion, in the grand hall, a painting hung on the wall. It was an unremarkable piece at first glance, an oil painting of an old, crumbling street at dusk. Yet something about it felt wrong, unsettling. The longer one stared, the more it seemed to warp, the lines blurring in a way that suggested a deep, hidden movement within the frame. It was as if the painting was alive, breathing with the rhythm of the house itself. Strange things had happened to those who had dared to stay too long near that painting. Some said they had seen the figures in the painting move, the distant figures on the street slowly walking, their faces hidden in shadow, until they were no longer just part of the scene but something far more tangible. Others claimed to have heard whispers emanating from the canvas, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to beckon them closer, to peer deeper into the scene. But what was most unsettling of all was the sensation, the feeling of being watched, not just from behind, but from within the painting itself. A constant pressure on the back of the neck, a cold breath on the skin, as if invisible eyes followed every movement, every blink. There were stories, old, forgotten stories, that spoke of a curse tied to the painting. The story went that the artist had painted it after a series of tragic events, each one more sorrowful than the last. A broken family, a lost love, a life destroyed by choices made in the heat of passion. The artist's mind had shattered in the process, and the painting was said to be the physical manifestation of his madness. Those who viewed it too long, or perhaps too closely, would begin to see strange things, unexplainable things, that could drive them to the brink of insanity. One such person had been found, years ago, their mind completely consumed by the painting. They had raved about seeing shadows moving in the streets, figures walking toward them, beckoning them into the world within the frame. But when others went to look, the scene remained unchanged. Nothing had moved. Nothing was out of place, and yet that feeling persisted. The painting's curse lingered, taking hold of the minds of those who dared to let it. It was not until the night had fallen completely that the true horror began. The mansion, silent and still, seemed to awaken. The floorboards creaked as though something were moving in the shadows, slowly making its way across the room. The faintest sound, barely a whisper, echoed through the hall. It was not a voice, but something far darker, a scratching like nails dragging across stone. The painting, too, seemed to change. The scene, once a dull street, now pulsed with a strange energy. The shadows grew deeper, and the figures, those faceless figures, moved ever so slightly. The temperature in the room dropped further, and a cold wind began to swirl, despite the sealed windows. It was as if the house itself had grown aware, as though it too were part of the painting, an extension of whatever malevolent force had bound itself to the canvas. The whispers grew louder now, clearer, but still incomprehensible. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against the heart, making the air feel even thicker, harder to breathe. The scratching grew louder, sharper, as though something was clawing at the walls, trying to break free. And then, the sound came. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, not from the house, but from within the painting. The figures, once distant, were now walking closer, step by step. Each footfall was a heavy thud, each one vibrating through the floor as though the ground itself had become part of the canvas. The figures were no longer silent. As they walked, they began to murmur in low, guttural tones. The words were unintelligible, but the sound, there was something in the tone that made the blood run cold. A chilling recognition of something ancient, something wrong. The painting, now fully animated, seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. The street, once static, now stretched and warped as though it were alive. The faces of the figures became more distinct, but they were not human. Their features were twisted, elongated, their eyes hollow voids that stared into the soul. The whispers rose into a frantic crescendo, a chorus of voices that grew louder and louder until they filled the room. They screamed without sound, their mouths gaping wide, but no sound came from them. Only the pressing sensation of pressure, of suffocation. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The painting froze, the figures once again motionless, their eyes still staring. The room was thick with the smell of decay, and the temperature was unbearable. The air felt as though it had been poisoned. The cursed painting hung on the wall, unchanged. But something had shifted. Something had been unleashed. And somewhere in the distance, behind the walls of the mansion, the sound of scratching began again, louder this time, like claws scraping against stone. Story 2. The mansion sat alone at the edge of a forgotten town, untouched by time, its towering frame a mere shadow of its former grandeur. The once sturdy walls now sagged under the weight of years, their cracks weeping dust like old wounds. The air around the house felt different, thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere mourned the decay that had overtaken it. The trees around the mansion were twisted and blackened, their limbs reaching like bony fingers toward the sky, while the ground beneath them remained cold, too cold for a place that was once alive with nature. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, its halls empty, save for the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The townsfolk avoided it, calling it haunted, cursed, a place where no soul could stay without losing something of themselves. Yet, the most curious tale surrounding the mansion was the one about the painting. It was said to be the centerpiece of the mansion's grand hall, a work of art so compelling, so disturbingly perfect, that it drew anyone who gazed upon it into a hypnotic trance. Those who saw it described the scene in the painting, an old narrow alleyway shrouded in mist with dim lights flickering in the distance. Figures walked through the fog, their faces obscured, their bodies bent as if carrying an unseen burden. But what made the painting truly terrifying was not just the eerie scene it depicted. It was the feeling that something was wrong, something unnatural. Those who dared to stand too long before it began to report strange happenings, unnerving noises, glimpses of movement in the background, shadows stretching unnaturally across the painted alley. The most chilling part of all was the sensation that the figures in the painting were staring directly at the viewer, their eyes cold and lifeless, yet somehow knowing. It wasn't long before people began to disappear. First, it was the occasional wanderer, those who ventured into the mansion seeking shelter or exploring out of curiosity. They came back, yes, but changed. Their eyes seemed distant, hollow, as if they had glimpsed something terrible in that painting and couldn't look away. They would often mutter under their breath, as if speaking to someone only they could see. But it wasn't just the people who were affected. Animals too stayed away from the mansion. The air around it was thick with an energy that made their fur stand on end, their instincts warning them to keep their distance. The house sat silent for years, forgotten by most until one cold autumn evening. A young artist named Lyle, drawn by the stories and the lure of mystery, arrived at the mansion. Lyle had heard the rumors, the whispers in the dark about the cursed painting. He had always been a skeptic, disbelieving in such superstitions, but his curiosity led him to take the long walk down the overgrown path to the mansion's front door. The door groaned as Lyle pushed it open, and the scent of mildew hit him like a wave. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, the floor creaking under his boots as he moved deeper into the house. Dust swirled in the air, caught in the faint moonlight that filtered through broken windows. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant slow ticking of an old clock that had long since stopped. The grand hall was just as the stories described it. The painting hung at the far end, framed in an ornate gold frame, its surface cracked and worn. The colors were dark, almost suffocating, and the alleyway painted in mist seemed to draw him in. The flickering light in the background seemed to pulse, and the figures, though painted, seemed to shift with each blink. Lyle stepped closer, feeling a shiver run down his spine. His eyes locked onto the figures, and for a brief moment he thought he saw one of them move, just the slightest shift. His heart began to race. He blinked and the figure was still. His hand reached out as if to touch the cold surface of the painting. His fingers hovered inches from the canvas before the air around him suddenly chilled. The silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive. His breath caught in his throat as a strange sense of unease spread through him. Then came the first sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, as though something, or someone, was moving through the house. Lyle turned, his eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of the room, but there was nothing there. The scratching continued, growing louder, more frantic until it stopped. Lyle's heart raced in his chest. He turned back to the painting. The figures were no longer stationary. They had moved imperceptibly, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through him. One figure had stepped forward from the mist, its face still hidden in shadow. The flickering light seemed to pulse faster, its glow growing unnaturally bright, then fading to nothing. He backed away, his feet stumbling over the debris scattered across the floor. His breath became shallow, quick, as though he were suffocating. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, as though the house itself was closing in on him. His back hit the wall, and for a moment he couldn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the painting. The figure in the painting was staring directly at him now, its cold, empty eyes piercing into his soul. Lyle could feel its gaze as though it were inside his mind, probing, searching, reaching for something deep within him. He could hear it now, whispers, not from around him but from within his own mind. Low guttural sounds like ancient voices that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, the scratching noise returned. But this time, it was not from the walls. It was from behind him. He whirled around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure just out of sight, moving in the periphery of his vision. He spun, but it was gone. The ground beneath him trembled. The walls groaned as though the house itself was coming alive. Lyle's eyes darted back to the painting. The figure had stepped entirely out of the frame, its body now a mere shadow, a dark shape against the flickering light. The whispers grew into a maddening chorus, overwhelming him, suffocating him. His mind was beginning to crack, his senses dulled by the horror surrounding him. It was then that he realized the figure wasn't alone. Others were emerging from the mist. Figures, their faces still hidden but now closer, their shadows stretching across the floor. And the whispers, they were words now, clear and unmistakable. "Join us," Lyle screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. His legs failed him and he collapsed to the ground. His vision blurred, the room spinning, as the figures in the painting drew closer, their feet dragging through the air as though they were floating. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. The last thing he heard was the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind him, followed by a slow, methodical scraping of feet on the floor. Then, there was nothing but darkness. The mansion stood silent once again, the painting now completely still. The figures had returned to their place within the canvas, their cold, lifeless eyes watching the empty hall. But for those who dared to venture too close, the whispers continued. And the scratching, it never... Story 3. The night was thick with fog, wrapping around the house like a cold, suffocating embrace. The mansion, a hulking presence on the edge of town, stood in silence, its windows dark and lifeless, a ghost of its former self. The trees outside, twisted and barren, seemed to sway in a rhythm that was unnatural, as though they were responding to some unseen force, pulling and pushing in ways that defied the wind. The mansion had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It had once belonged to a family of wealthy aristocrats, but now only the memories of those long gone lingered in its rotting walls. The townspeople rarely spoke of it anymore, their voices hushed whenever the mansion came up in conversation, for it was said that something lingered within, a presence, a malevolent force tied to the house itself. What intrigued the few who dared approach the house was not just its history or the stories of its strange occurrences, but the rumors of a painting that had been hidden in one of its forgotten rooms. The painting was said to be nothing extraordinary at first glance. It depicted a serene landscape, a tranquil lake under a pale blue sky, with a small isolated house by the water. But the longer one stared at it, the more unsettling it became. The colors were off, too bright, too unnatural for such a scene. The trees in the background seemed to shift and move ever so slightly when no one was looking directly at them, and the waters of the lake, though painted in perfect stillness, seemed to ripple in a way that suggested there was something beneath the surface, something that wanted to break free. For years, the painting remained in a hidden room, tucked away behind a locked door that no one dared open. It was said that the artist who had painted it had gone mad shortly after completing the piece. Some believed he had tried to destroy it but was stopped, his final screams echoing through the mansion as if trapped within the painting itself. The room was sealed after his death, and the painting was forgotten by all, buried under layers of dust and time. Yet the stories persisted. The whispers told of those who ventured too close to that room, those who were drawn by the painting's allure. Some said that it called to you, its subtle pull irresistible until you could no longer resist its lure. And once you looked into the painting long enough, once you crossed that threshold, you were never the same. One evening, a young couple, Alex and Emma, arrived at the mansion. They were newcomers to the town, seeking an adventure in the decaying remnants of history. Alex, the more daring of the two, had heard the rumors about the painting and insisted on finding it. Emma, though apprehensive, agreed to accompany him, mostly to humor him. The air was thick with the smell of decay as they stepped through the mansion's front door. The wooden floors creaked beneath their feet, and the walls, once grand, now stood in crumbling ruin. They made their way through the dusty hallways, past forgotten furniture draped in cobwebs and forgotten memories, until they reached the farthest corner of the mansion. There, hidden behind an old tapestry, was a door, sealed shut, its handle long rusted with age. Alex's eyes gleamed with excitement as he pushed against the door, the hinges groaning in protest. A cloud of dust billowed out as the door cracked open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Without hesitation, Alex led the way, Emma reluctantly following behind. They ascended the stairs, each step taking them deeper into the forgotten heart of the mansion. The air grew colder and the silence was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on them as they reached the top of the stairs and found themselves in front of a door. The door to the forgotten room. Alex opened it without a second thought, and they stepped inside. The room was like a time capsule, untouched by the years. The air was heavy, thick with the staleness of disuse. Dust coated every surface, but in the center of the room, standing in a grand frame, was the painting. At first glance it appeared harmless, even beautiful. The tranquil lake, the soft blues of the sky, the small house standing serenely by the shore. But as they stepped closer, something in the painting seemed to shift. The sky, once serene, now appeared darker, almost unnaturally so. The trees, once static, seemed to move ever so slightly, their limbs swaying as if they were caught in an unseen breeze. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. The air in the room had grown colder, and a strange unease settled over her like a weight. She could feel the painting pulling at her, beckoning her to look closer, to peer deeper into the scene. "It's just a painting, Emma," Alex said, his voice far too casual for the atmosphere. "It's just a trick of the light." But Emma didn't respond. She was too focused on the lake and the painting. It seemed to ripple now, just like in the stories. The surface of the water began to stir, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move beneath the surface. A shadow, a shape that shouldn't have been there. Alex moved to the side, admiring the painting from a different angle, but Emma remained rooted in place. Her eyes traced the outline of the house in the painting, and that's when she saw it. The door of the house in the painting was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see the dark interior. There was no light inside, just a deep, consuming blackness that seemed to reach out toward her. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Alex turned, and for a moment he didn't speak. He moved to her side and peered at the painting, his brow furrowing. "There's nothing there," he said. "You're just seeing things. The dark corners, the shadows. It's all part of the atmosphere. It's just a painting." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her eyes kept returning to the dark house in the painting, to the black void behind the slightly open door. She could almost hear something faint, like a low hum or a murmur rising from the depths of the painting. And then the temperature dropped. The room grew colder, so cold that Emma's breath misted in the air. The scratching sound, faint at first, began again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the painting itself. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figures in the painting, the ones walking near the lake, had shifted again. They weren't standing still anymore. They were moving, walking slowly toward the house, their steps measured, deliberate. Their eyes, which had once been vague and shadowed, now glowed with an unnatural light. "Alex," Emma's voice trembled. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The door in the painting, the one that had once been slightly ajar, was now wide open. The darkness inside seemed to expand, as though it were alive, pulling them in. The figures, no longer distant, had crossed the threshold of the house and were stepping onto the shore of the lake, their footsteps silent and unnerving. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, a gust of wind tore through the room, extinguishing the candle they had brought with them. The room plunged into complete darkness. Emma screamed, but it was swallowed by the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. She reached out, but her hand brushed against something cold, something that shouldn't have been there. The painting, no longer a mere image, was alive, and it was reaching for them. The last thing Emma heard was the sound of footsteps, not from the painting but from behind her, growing louder, closer. And then, nothing. The mansion stood silent once more, the painting now completely still. The room had returned to its dusty, forgotten state. But somewhere, in the deepest corners of the house, the whispering continued. The scratching never stopped. Story 4. The mansion had stood for centuries, untouched by time and yet deeply marked by it. Beneath its decaying stone facade, it exhaled the heavy breath of abandonment. The forest surrounding it was dark and suffocating, the trees so close to each other that they blocked out the stars, leaving the house cloaked in an oppressive eternal night. The whispers of the past lingered in the air, as though the house itself remembered everything that had happened within its walls. No one had dared approach the mansion in years. It had become the subject of horror stories, passed down through generations. The locals spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all. And though it was located at the farthest edge of town, the mansion never failed to attract curiosity. Some said the house was alive. Its walls pulsed with the ghosts of its former occupants, and those who entered often did not return. But the most chilling story surrounding the mansion was that of the painting. It had been locked away in the attic, hidden from sight for as long as anyone could remember. It was said that the painting was not just a work of art. It was a doorway, a trap that drew the souls of anyone who gazed too long into its depths. The painting depicted a family, a mother, father, and their 2 children, standing in front of the mansion, their faces pale and lifeless, as if captured in an eternal moment of despair. Behind them, the mansion loomed, dark and foreboding, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the unknown. One evening, a group of explorers, driven by nothing more than thrill-seeking, decided to enter the house. Among them was Claire, a young woman with a fascination for history and art. She had heard the stories of the painting and was determined to find it. She believed the rumors of its curse were nothing more than superstition, but she was wrong. It was late when they arrived, the sun sinking low behind the trees, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. The house seemed to loom over them, like a forgotten titan, waiting to claim its next victim. They explored the house room by room, finding nothing but broken furniture and shattered glass. The mansion was a hollow shell of what it had once been, but Claire could feel it, the presence that lingered in the corners, in the dark spaces between the walls. Finally, after what felt like hours, they found the staircase leading to the attic. It was narrow, steep, and winding, the wooden steps threatening to give way with every footfall. At the top, they found the attic door, old and rotting, barely hanging on its hinges. Inside the attic, the air was thick and stale, filled with the scent of dust and something else, something darker. The walls were lined with old furniture, covered in tattered sheets, and in the center of the room, on a pedestal, was the painting. It was larger than Claire had imagined, its frame intricate and dark, as if it had been carved from the very wood of the house itself. The painting, though beautiful at first glance, was unsettling. The figures in the painting, though their faces were painted with precision, had an unnatural stillness to them. Their eyes, though seemingly lifelike, were vacant, like empty windows to a soul long lost. Claire stepped closer, drawn to the painting despite the unease that prickled at the back of her neck. The others in her group seemed to feel it too, but they were too curious to turn back. As Claire's eyes lingered on the family and the painting, she noticed something strange. The father's hand, which was resting gently on the shoulder of the mother, seemed to twitch. It was subtle at first, but it was unmistakable. She blinked, thinking it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, the father's hand was still, motionless. And the eyes of the family, they were no longer lifeless. They were watching her, staring directly into her soul. The sensation was so intense, so overwhelming that Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. "Claire, are you okay?" one of her friends asked, his voice shaking, but Claire couldn't answer. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the painting. The longer she stared, the more she felt the presence in the room grow, thick and suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The temperature in the attic dropped, and she could see her breath fogging in the air even though it wasn't cold. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible like a distant murmur from the depths of the house. But then they grew louder, more insistent. Claire could hear them now, clearly, as if they were coming from just behind her. A low, guttural voice echoed in her ears, speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but she could feel the words clawing at her mind, trying to break through. And then, in an instant, the father's hand in the painting was no longer still. It was reaching out toward her, stretching impossibly far from the canvas. His face, once a mere shadow, now bore a grotesque smile, twisted and wide, like something ancient and hungry. Claire stumbled backward, her heart racing, but her feet wouldn't move. She felt the pull of the painting, drawing her in, its gaze locking onto her, consuming her. The last thing Claire saw before the darkness took her was the father's outstretched hand, reaching for her, his fingers brushing against her skin, cold and unyielding. The mansion stood silent once more, the painting hanging in the attic, its figures now still again. Their eyes locked on the empty room, but the whispers never stopped. And for those who dared to enter, the painting would always be waiting, its cursed gaze drawing them into its depths.